I mean, you got to think the founding fathers did not imagine that America would last as long as it did. Pretty famously, they all kind of thought it was going to last for a few generations and then things would move on to something else. America is currently about 250 years old, and we're the longest running current democracy because it is very hard to keep a democracy together. By definition, it's going to be tricky. And we're doing our best to fix the system and make things work. But I feel like we need to acknowledge the fact that this wasn't ever going to last forever. Try it at home right now. Say out loud, I thought America was going to last forever. You sound stupid, right? Think back through history. Every other country has risen and eventually fallen. What is it about America that you thought was just going to last in perpetuity? I mean, the only thing we can really compare this to in terms of democracies is like the Roman Republic. And I mean, dig deep into the circumstances of the Roman Republic. It was not America. It was much smaller and a lot of people couldn't vote. So it lasted for as long as it did. And then it turned into the, Holy Roman Empire. And that lasted for a long time too. And eventually that ended because things have to end. So maybe that's a much healthier way for us to think about America as a thing that's started and eventually will stop. Because that means we can focus on what comes next instead of tying ourselves in knots trying to chase the past and fix things that are clearly unfixable and can only result in a compromise that's going to make people furious. So maybe we should just think about America as a pop-up business. It's like, hey, we're going to open up a thing and it's going to last for a while. And then when it stops working, we're going to do a new thing because clearly what we're doing now is not working. So let's just take what we have and make something new. It's November and we're going to stop selling ice cream because it's cold outside. It really feels like more Americans than ever really want to visit Japan. More so than other Asian countries, and even more so than like most parts of Europe, outside of maybe Paris. I think this has more to do with America than it does Japan or Japanese culture specifically. Because I mean, if you really want Japanese food, most big cities have good ramen or sushi or something. And if you're into like anime, it's like you can stream that if you really want to find it. Maybe like, 30 years ago, there would have been some advantage to going to Japan physically to find manga or something. But these days, basically everything is available everywhere. I think this has more to do with America itself. There really is a sense that things are starting to fall apart, just on a basic level. Things are breaking down and nobody is really coming to fix it. And this isn't just, American politics or like, the infrastructure or something. This is just on a very basic civil level. Something is just not working anymore. People are becoming more selfish, more self-centered. And there's really nothing you can do to bring back decency and civility. There's not more laws you can pass or messages you can spread. It's just something that people either have or they don't. I think you see it most in the way that people act when they're in their car. They're in the freeway and they're driving in the emergency lane. If there's traffic, they're cutting each other off. Americans will park on the sidewalk if you let them. Shared spaces in general are becoming ruined. And there's just no sense that anything is actually getting better. That's why I think people want to go to a place where things still kind of work. And there is still a basic sense of public decency in the air. And it's not like, top down. We're not talking about, Soviet-style repression. There's not like there's more cops in Japan. There's not. It comes from people feeling like they have a shared responsibility to maintain order. And this shared responsibility comes from being self-conscious. Self-consciousness is necessary to having order. It's what stops you from acting like an idiot in public. It's because you don't want to look bad. You don't want to bring shame on yourself. And that thought process of self-consciousness is antithetical to American life. In America, people are encouraged to be themselves. You're encouraged to put yourself first. You know, they call it the main character syndrome. In America, you are the main character of your movie. In Japan, the main character is everybody. I get the sense that people who visit Japan really like it, and they tend to recommend it to everybody else. I would say if you're interested in visiting Japan, you should probably go soon, because this isn't going to last. Everything you're going there to see is not going to be around forever. And it's not because Japanese people are becoming more American. It's just because there's so many American tourists in Japan right now. Like, a memo went out at some point that there's more to see in Japan outside of Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka. So now there's just American people everywhere. And the more Americans show up everywhere in Japan, the more they start acting like Americans. People start getting pushy and, territorial. And the thing is, everything I'm talking about here, we could have that in America. There is nothing materially preventing it from happening. There's nothing that's stopping us from becoming thoughtful and considerate in public. I mean, if you start doing it, maybe it'll spread. Maybe that guy who's driving in the emergency lane will look around and think, wow, I look like an asshole right now. I probably shouldn't do this. Maybe. I mean, probably not. I've been seeing the national debt come up a lot in recent discourse. Anytime you're in a conversation and the national debt comes up, that means that somebody is trying to take something from you. Or they're trying to tell you that something you want, you can't have because we can't afford it. Look at all this debt. It's $38 trillion. Let's focus on paying that off first. I think this conversation has gone way too far in one direction. I think we got to bring it back to reality and just think about what it is we're actually talking about. The national debt is a good thing. It is the sign that the system is working. When you see that $38 trillion tag or whatever it is, that's how well it's working. Look, the U.S. government doesn't have debt the way you have debt. We don't borrow money the way that you borrow money from a bank or from a relative or something. The U.S. government sells treasury bonds, and investors, individuals, countries, banks around the world buy U.S. treasuries because they are the most stable investment in the entire universe. Everybody wants U.S. treasuries. I mean, think about when you put money into a bank, and like a savings account at a bank. When you put that money in, that bank owes you all of that money, plus interest. But banks still want your money because that's how banks work. They take that money and they invest it in something, and they make enough that they can still pay you back. The U.S. government works the same way. We don't have debt. What we have is deposits. People around the world buy U.S. treasuries because they trust us with their money. This is a stable place to put your money. Throughout the years, the treasury notes have always rolled over. We are A1 credit. The problem is that when people see the word debt, they think, oh, we better pay that off. They think, oh, we're in the red. We better get back to the black. Look, all the people who are buying these treasury notes, the people that we supposedly owe all this money to, they don't want us to pay everything off. Because if we paid everything off and we stopped issuing treasury bonds, they wouldn't have anywhere to put their money. I mean, go back through history and find all the places where the U.S. government got out of debt completely. All the places where we actually got out of red and got back to black. The most famous example was in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson. He was famously very paranoid about debt, so he made sure to pay everything off, and he actually got us back into black. But what happened was, when he stopped selling U.S. treasuries, those people had nowhere to put their money. And all that money ended up in the market, which led to a huge speculative bubble, which quickly burst and sent the country into a massive depression. Because there was no stability. That's what this entire system runs on, is stability. People put the money here because it is a stable place to put your money, and we've always been good on it. That's why when you see that $38 trillion tagline, it seems scary and it seems like a burden, but that's a sign of the system working. Every treasury note we sell is a vote of confidence from an investor. That's how confident people are that this system is going to keep running, that they're going to keep buying treasury notes. Look, everybody who has bought treasury notes wants us to be stable so that they get their money back. Everybody who's about to buy treasuries wants that first group to get their money back because they want the system to keep running. The U.S. government's role is to keep the whole system moving. They put the money here, and we provide the service of stability, and in return, we get liquidity, and we can actually function as a country. We're not constantly scrambling to figure out where the money's going to come from. That's why it's so stupid when people use the national debt as an excuse to cut social services or to cut back on infrastructure spending. Because in their mind, their justification is we can't afford it. But what they're doing is creating instability. What they're doing when they say we can't afford something like universal health care, they're creating a system in which people freeze up. They don't want to quit their job because they don't want to lose their health insurance. They're afraid to go uninsured because they see all these people who are uninsured getting screwed over at the hospital. They end up being afraid to invest. And people around the world, they see what's happening. They see our current situation where everybody hates each other and everything feels so shaky. And people around the world start thinking, yeah, maybe the U.S. is not a good place to put my money. The problem is not debt. The problem is stability. It's not about can we afford this. It's about does America still look like a good place to put your money? So much of the conversation around the national debt, you end up with hearing this phrase like, what are we going to leave our grandkids? We can't leave our grandkids all of this debt. I think the better question to ask is, what did our grandparents leave us? They left us the interstate highway system. They left us the Brooklyn Bridge, GPS satellites. They left us with stuff that we could actually use to grow as a country. All of these things were massively expensive at the time they made them, but they were worthwhile. Look, I bet you when the national highway system was first proposed, there was probably somebody who was saying, hey, we can't afford this. Think about all the debt. We're going to screw over our grandkids. And if we had listened to that person, we would still be on the Oregon Trail. Imagine if you actually could talk to your great-grandkids. What would you tell them about the current moment? It's like, hey, great news. We cut the deficit a little bit. Feels like the country is in a sort of mania right now for budget cuts in the name of efficiency. The British call it austerity, but in America we call it being efficient. I feel like it is worth taking a moment to really ask ourselves the question, is efficiency a good thing? Is this a goal we should be working towards? I feel like the answer is definitely no. In fact, I think inefficiency is another word for humanity. All the things you really love in life are there because they're inefficient. I mean, just think about like the UFC, for example. The UFC started with the fundamental question of what is the best martial art? Is it karate? Is it kickboxing, jiu-jitsu? And the reason it was so compelling was because it was so experimental and everybody was trying all these different things and it was really wacky and idiosyncratic and these sort of strange characters emerged. Any UFC fan who was there from the beginning has seen the sport evolve over the years. But the question was always, what is the best martial art? Now, 30 years in, we've gotten our answer. And it's grappling, Dagestani grappling. Grab, control, and hold. That is the most efficient way to win a UFC fight. And it's boring. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any UFC fan who prefers the current state of the sport to previous eras. And those previous eras were exciting precisely because they were inefficient. People were doing different things. Look, people hear the word martial art, they really forget the second word is art. The whole beauty of martial arts comes from doing things that you don't necessarily have to do. I mean, what's the point of martial arts anyways when we have guns? What's the point of guns when we have bombs? The point is it's cool, which is why we were doing it in the first place. Think about the NBA. The NBA back in the day used to be a collision of styles. Big men, post-ups, mid-range, guys who were shooting the long ball. Phoenix Suns, 7 seconds or less. Over time, things have optimized to become more efficient, which is the most efficient way to win an NBA game is shooting threes. It's spacing. Slash and kick, shoot the three in the corner, or try to draw a foul. I mean, their job is to win the game, so everybody's going to try to win. You can change the rules if you want, but they're just going to optimize for the new thing, and eventually it's going to be boring again. I mean, the irony of all of these budget cuts and this talk about efficiency is that the American government is trying to compete with the Chinese government. And the Chinese government is famously inefficient. You think just the way they carry themselves that they would really be like cutthroat businessmen and everything would be really like, harsh austerity. But the Chinese government spends like crazy. That's why the economy has grown over there in the last 30 years. They build bridges to nowhere. They build highways that are redundant because there's already a highway. They have the biggest high-speed rail system in the entire world. And really, most people in the country only ride the rail like once a year. Everybody travels during Chinese New Year's for like a week. And that's it. I mean, for the rest of the year, Chinese people have stuff to do. They got iPhones to build. They're not just riding the trains. Most of those high-speed rail trains go to cities that like don't even have people in them. But you build all that stuff because it's good to have stuff, and it builds national pride. I mean, America has efficiency, which leads to not building stuff. China has inefficiency, which leads to having more stuff. I mean, what would you rather have? Some American accountant would look at the Chinese economy and would look at the high-speed rail system and think, oh, what a waste. Think about all the money they could be saving. And it's like, for what? What's the point of any of this? Why would they want to save money? They have the trains. That's the whole point. I mean, they're trying to cut the budget for national parks. And it's like, look, I'll admit, national parks are not an efficient use of money. That's kind of the whole point of having a national park. It doesn't have to be there, but we're putting it there anyways because it's nice to have a park. It's like, yeah, you can't bring an accountant into that question because you know what they're going to say. Modern conservative politics are based around this idea that America lost something, and we used to have a shared culture, a moral center, and a unified way of life that has now been lost, that we have to get back to. You hear about the monoculture, that we used to have a single culture that has now been broken up by, diversity, or whatever they're talking about. The reason why conservative politics is always kind of flimsy, and the reason why it falls apart under basic scrutiny, is the fact that it's based on this idea of a monoculture. And this whole idea is completely false at its core. America never had a monoculture. I mean, just historically, go back to the very beginning. This country was based on diversity and pluralism. I mean, why do you think there were 13 colonies? as opposed to one big colony. There were 13 colonies because of diversity, because of plurality. Some colonies were Quakers or Protestant, Catholic, Baptist. It was diverse culturally. I mean, obviously, there were African slaves, English settlers, French, Irish, German immigrants, people coming from everywhere. The mercantile North, plantation South, different ways of life were coexisting. What we had was 13 colonies that barely came together to win a war against the British. I mean, people talk about the Constitution being a foundational document for this country, but there was no Constitution in the beginning. They won the war, and then it was 3 whole years before they even got around to making the Constitution. And then the Constitution took 9 months to ratify, and even then it barely got ratified. 9 out of 13. America was founded on disagreement, a barely held together coalition that agreed just enough to stay together. I mean, modern conservative politics, the Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump strain, is really based on a kind of nostalgia for the past. I mean, the values that they're looking back towards is always the 1950s. The 1950s are seen in American politics as kind of the last simple era before everything got complicated. The problem with this is that this really is based on TV. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an actor. He was from the TV era. The thing that when Americans think about the 1950s, the thing they picture is Happy Days. They picture a TV show about the 1950s when everything looks clean and nice. What's so weird to me about Happy Days, though, is that, I grew up in the 90s, so I remember watching Happy Days on syndication, like Nick at Night or whatever. I thought Happy Days was a show from the 1950s. It wasn't until later that I found out that Happy Days was a show from the 1970s about the 1950s. The 1970s is a very dark time in America. Economic recession, Cold War politics. So people were dreaming for a simpler time. They go back and they thought back to the 1950s, and that's how you end up with Happy Days. But the 1950s were not a simple time in America. The 1950s were very diverse. This was not pre-diversity America. The 1950s is when you get the civil rights movement. It's when you get the beginning of women's liberation, white flight to the suburbs, Puerto Ricans showing up in New York City. And this wasn't the beginning of something. This was a natural continuation of what America always was. The civil rights movement did not start diversity. It revealed it. It showed what was always there. There was never a monoculture. It was always all of these competing factions that were held together by just barely shared purpose. I mean, when you hear conservatives talk about missing the monoculture, there was no monoculture for them to miss. What they miss was cultural dominance. They miss Happy Days. They miss the idea that one group got to tell the story, as opposed to a bunch of competing groups, which were always there. The irony is that, conservatives spent decades pushing free market capitalism and individualism, and then they wonder why things got a little fractured. They complain that people aren't on the same page anymore, while also pushing private school vouchers. They want people to be on the same page, while also forcing them to scramble for the basic necessities of life, healthcare, housing. And then they wonder why people are fighting. People are fighting because you made them fight. You wanted a free market economy, but without free market ideas. And that's not how it works. Once it breaks apart, it's broken.